Dear friends, very happy to be in Sharjah. One reason is because it feels quite normal, unlike other Gulf cities I've visited. I don't want to be too rude because I have probably to go to some of them again. But anyway, thanks. What I want to really talk about today is politics and culture. How each infects the other, how each works on the other, and how there's never any real way to divide the two. I know some people try, but it can't be, the two aren't divided because they're part of the same world. And this is nothing new. People say that this is, the 20th century and its bad habits, mixing politics and culture. But actually, it goes way, way back. It goes back to the ancient world. It goes back to the poetry of Hesiod, who was a contemporary, supposedly, of Homer, and who wrote the most amazing poems in the ancient world about the lives of ordinary people and the lives of the peasants and what they lived on. They are very contemporary, and many poets in the 20th and the current centuries write about them. Or you think of the plays of Aristophanes, again in ancient Greece, where, for instance, confronted by continuing wars, Aristophanes writes a play in which he appeals to the women to move a step forward and stop these wars, and suggests in this play, which is both very political and very funny, that women married to men, living with men, should stop sleeping with them till they promise not to fight again. Now, this could be quite contemporary. So, throughout history, there's been this drive for artists, for poets, for writers, painters, sculptors to intervene when they feel it is necessary to do so. This is nothing modern. There's nothing modern about it. It's part of the world. It's part of being in the world in different times, in different centuries. And, you can look at, Shakespeare's play, Coriolanus, is about an armed uprising and what that uprising did and what the demands of the people were. They side forth proverbs, writes Shakespeare. We need more food. Now, when is that not relevant in large parts of today's world? So what I want to stress is the universality and also the timelessness of politics and culture. There are, there always will be, there always were groups, writers of ordinary people who sang, wrote poetry, big, long tradition of that in the Arab world. Not too far from here, in Aleppo, Syrian town, lived Abu Lala al-Ma'ari, great Arab poet and satirist as well. And in the 11th century, he wrote some of the most amazing poetry, amazing in the sense that it was extremely advanced politically. attacking the institution of marriage, for instance, as long ago as that, saying what it did. And he even did something which today would be inconceivable. This is all part of that early Arab tradition that Abu al-Mari wrote his version of the Quran, the holy book of Islam. And people, his friends would tease him in his circle. They're saying, but you know, you've written this, but no one's reading it, whereas the Quran is read by everyone. He said, wait another 500 years. So this arrogance that was bred into these people was part of that culture. Or if you look at the poetry of Walada, roughly the same period, I think she's the 12th century in Cordoba, and she wrote the most amazing poems about her relationships and her big fight with Ibn Zaydun, whose poetry is still taught today in primary schools in large parts of the Arab world. So there's this tradition that we forget, and we shouldn't. Now, when I'm asked by some people, what is the most startling example of politics coming and intervening in culture, I said what is regarded in Western culture as the first great modern novel, Cervantes' Don Quixote, is packed with historical references. And people don't read it like that. Harold Bloom, the great in inverted commas American academic who introduces this book, doesn't know what it's really about, in my opinion. Because the book is suffused with references to Islam in Spain and also sometimes to Judaism. What people forget is the context in which great works of art are produced. They are produced not in isolation or not in patting ourselves on the back and saying, aren't we great? Look. But they're produced in contexts which affect everyone. In what was the context when Cervantes wrote Don Quixote? The context was 16th century Spain. The Jews had all been expelled from Spain in 1492, and every last Muslim was told either convert or get out. In 1526 was the large, big expulsion of Muslims who had lived in this part of the world. Most of them had converted from either Christianity or pre-Christian religions. And that is what caused Cervantes to sit down and write this novel. And if you read the very opening, and he says, this novel actually isn't written by me. I was taking a walk in the Alcana Bazaar in Tulaitala, which is Toledo, and in the Alcana Bazaar you can still find some old manuscripts in the language of the Moors. And I picked up this manuscript, and there it was, and I hired a translator, and he translated it for me into Castilian, and here it is. It's not even written by me. The real author is a Muslim. Now, why is he writing this? Because the fight against the Inquisition, or the Inquisition's campaign against Muslims and Jews to check whether they really converted, had reached such a stage that he wanted to express his solidarity. And throughout the novel, you can find passages where Don Quixote and Sancho Panza arrive at a village, and no one lives in the village. Now, modern readers of it, unless it's explained, won't know why they don't live in the village. The author does, and people who read the book in Spain do. They were all expelled. So large numbers of villages lie empty in that region. Now, what I wanted to do really was to explain to you something that is taking place now, taking place in our vicinity, which Hur al-Qassam already referred in her opening remarks, and that is the tragedy of Gaza. We live it. We see live-stream genocide on the screens, our television screens, every single day, and it can't be ignored. It's universal. Been huge, millions and millions of people have marched throughout the world to try and stop it. And I want to start by just again discussing images with you. So a few days ago, a young American in uniform, an Air Force pilot, Aaron Bushnell, dressed up in his full uniform, marched outside the embassy of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., and set himself on fire. And he left behind a note saying, "I'm dying to express my solidarity with the people of Gaza, and I'm dying in protest against what my own country is doing in arming the regime that is doing this to the Palestinians. And all my money and what little wealth I've got, I'm going to leave behind for the Palestinian children who survive." And he burned himself. The next day, most of this information, let's talk about technology, we found out through the internet, not through the mainstream press. Just within minutes, obviously, someone had been alerted to film him, probably one of his friends, and he sent that out with his message. So we read about it, and we knew about it. And interestingly enough, a day later, when you felt this should be on the front page of every single newspaper in the world, the Financial Times and The Guardian, two sort of serious papers, what did they have on their front pages? Propaganda images of join the army of a British soldier running in front of a large fire that is on his side. Both of them had the same photograph on their front pages. And I thought about that, and I said, this is really disgusting. Someone's given up his life for a cause. Right or wrong is besides the point now. He's gone. And this is what is being published in the media. And yesterday, 6 other American soldiers went and took off their military clothes and put them on a bonfire. Mercifully, they didn't kill themselves because they're needed. Good people like that are short on the ground. And they burnt their uniforms in solidarity with them. And suddenly, a small movement as yet has begun on the edges and margins and inside the American armed forces. Now that I respect hugely. And then you compare it to the Egyptian government, which says we're going to parachute the food down on Gaza. Gaza is 100 yards away from you guys. Why do you need to parachute it down? Can't you get the food across? And parachuting it down, what did it do 2 days ago? Effectively, the Israelis were waiting for the people to come and collect the food and massacred them. 100 people were killed. And the world can go on? We don't need to do anything? We talk about our own minute interests. How can this happen? And soon after the decision made by the Israeli government to really punish Gaza and to show the world the martyrdom they were inflicting on this tiny strip of land, which was like an open-air prison or a concentration camp, and has been like this for many, many decades since the occupation. What do we do? I'll tell you what I couldn't think about anything else. And I said, we have to do something we have to tell the history of how we've arrived at this pass. What's happened? And all I could think of doing was actually producing a play, an event, an opera. And I rang up Mark Johnford May, who is here, who is the artistic director of Isango, because I was on a train when I was reading these reports on my phone coming out of what the bombings were like and how people were being killed and how they were undiscriminating. And Mark ran, in my opinion, one of the best theaters and companies in South Africa. And I thought, this was the first week, long before South Africa took the case to the International Court of Justice. We should do something that unites South Africa with Palestine. A play in which half are Palestinians, half are South Africans, apart from, of course, Western figures and Israelis. These are the two big components who tell each other's histories, who talk to each other, who find out what was the form apartheid took in your country. This is what it's like in our country. And since then, I've been thinking about this, and we've been working. And now new things happen. People going for food are bombed. Aaron Bushnell sets himself on fire. And when he set himself on fire, my mind flashed back, because as you can see, I'm pretty old now, to Thich Quang Duc in 1963, the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire in the streets of Saigon at a big intersection to say, stop this war. A Buddhist monk did that, even though he knew that the bulk of the people fighting that war were communists. He did that because he said they must get out of our country, the Americans. We have to do that. Today there is a huge statue in his memory on that place in what is now called Ho Chi Minh City, marking his sacrifice. And I wondered, who will mark Aaron Bushnell's sacrifice? Not the official government, but people like us in different ways. So the question then arises, how does one do this? And the big master of epic drama in some ways was, of course, Bertolt Brecht, the great German playwright and poet of the 20th century. And he taught, someone criticized one of his plays and he said, look, epic theater or theater depicting an epic or a chamber house epic cannot be done naturalistically because it's not possible. We don't have the time, we don't have the money, we don't have the space. So it has of necessity to be a montage theater because the epic is a montage. You can't do it all, you have to pick and choose. And the first thing necessary to pick and choose in thinking about Gaza or an epic play about Gaza is how few people remember history. As if it all started on October the 7th with Hamas's raid on Israeli-held, it's occupied territory, but nonetheless, they don't see it as such, the Israelis, on that. As if it started then, not 75 years ago. As if the people who are in Gaza today most of them were refugees from the Nakba of 1948. When they were expelled from their villages, they went to Gaza, where they'd been attacked, Operation Cast-led, Operation this, Operation that, and treated as a prison. And I have to say this, that despite many, many voices in the opposition, especially the young Jewish kids who marched in New York and occupied Grand Central Station, chanting, "Genocide Joe has got to go." This is what the young Jewish kids were saying. But from our governments, from the governments in Europe, very little. From most of the Arab governments, very little. When the Yemenis decide their own form of solidarity, everyone attacks the Houthis. It's the only country which has shown even an elementary degree of solidarity with the Palestinian people and the Gazans. They say, stop destroying our ships. The Houthi leaders reply, get out of Gaza. Take the Israelis with you, just get out. Apart from that, all the Western governments, with the exception of Spain and Ireland, have backed what is going on. I mean, the Pentagon agreed today. They said it, that our intelligence figures are that 25,000 women and children alone have been murdered, exterminated, killed, call it what you will, genocided, since October the 7th. So the question rises, if you know this, why are you sitting there quietly? There are Americans marching on the streets, young and old. There's a history there that two right-wing American presidents, Eisenhower in the 50s and Reagan in the 80s, rang up the Israelis. The first did it when they had occupied Gaza, and Eisenhower said, get out of Gaza in a fortnight or we will impose sanctions on you. They left. Reagan did something similar. But these guys, paralyzed, not capable of doing anything. And the world has become now a world of total double standards. You can't doubt it. The Russians do something stupid, attack, occupy Ukraine, and there are, big demonstrations. The whole state apparatuses and machines in the West are turned against that. Fine, fine. Why don't you do it for Gaza? Why don't you have the same standards against Israel? How to depict these standards on the stage, on the theater, in a movie, in poetry? I don't know. We'll get there. We'll get there sooner or later. But the poems have begun to be written. The paintings are being done. Palestinians themselves, Palestinian artists, Palestinian singers are playing a large part in this. And in the case of the politicians of the Western world, ambitions and delusions of grandeur. That is effectively what is going on. They will not open their mouths. These are people who speak supposedly in the name of civilization. And civilization went by two names. Before it became civilization, it was the Christian religion. It was in the name of Christianity that the Puritans of England occupied the United States, and it was in the name of Christianity that the Roman Catholics of Spain occupied the whole of South America. And they wrote, their ideologues, the equivalents of the writers of today who defend Israel, wrote, well, we had to wipe a lot of them out because they refused to accept what we wanted them to do. Well, yes, they did. It was their country after all. And many of them in South America refused to convert and were wiped out. Some did convert, of course, as we know. But it's a horrific example, and these double standards started from them. One rule for us and one rule for them. How can we be treated the same? We are, after all, more advanced, more experienced. And summarize that in a sentence. We have more weapons, and they're more advanced weapons than these people have. That is effectively what they did in the two Americas. And that has been written about and commemorated and discussed all over South America and North America, to be fair. They don't sort of hide the fact that this took place, like it's impossible to hide the early genocide. And it's difficult to hide the first blood that was spilled in the rivers of America by the colonists. And it's difficult to hide how crucial slavery was to the development of capitalism in the United States and in Brazil. So history is something which is discouraged now because it's seen as something that the poor, the protesters, the dissenters might weaponize. But the Palestinians have a long historical memory, 75-year historical memory. They know what was done to them. You know, one of the most moving things I saw recently, talking about memories, was during the Spanish Civil War in the middle of in the 30s of the 20th century, when the German Nazis and the Italian fascists bombed Republican Spain to back a military dictator who would remove their elected government, they tested out the weapons they would use during the Second World War on the city of Guernica in Spain. And that produced Picasso's masterpiece, just to get back to politics and culture. That Picasso masterpiece, called Guernica, is known to large numbers of people because people are taught it. A, it's a phenomenal painting, and B, what is it? And then it's explained. It was the Spanish Civil War. During this onslaught, US-backed onslaught against Gaza, there was a very moving image. Tens of thousands of citizens of Guernica today marched out into their big squares. These are kids, young people, who have no memory of that except, but they do. They have no personal memory, but they do. And they took over the square, and it had obviously been carefully planned, and they stood with Palestinian colors. All of them. So you could see from the top as if it was the Palestinian flag that they were waving. And that form of cultural, political solidarity was greatly appreciated because a lot of Palestinians, the older ones particularly, are aware of what happened in Spain. And it's, you know, if you look at it doesn't stop. The young American painter, Kehinde Wiley, his painting The Archaeology of Silence is all about the attack on black people in the States. It's called, he started doing it during the Black Lives Matter. And it's debated, but he's forced people to think. What can you do? And I come from a part of the world, Pakistan, before that India, in which poetry played that part. You know, many people were not literate at those times in the 40s and 50s. They depended on their poets. And some of our greatest poets grew amidst the love of their people. It's the same in the Arab world, by the way. But you know, even when I was growing up, I could read and write. But there was nothing as magical as listening to Faiz, great Pakistani poet, to Sahir Ludhianvi, a great Indian poet, speaking at the same mushaira together, a poetry reading which went on for hours and hours and hours. And that was the way the population of these countries imbibed culture, was through poetry and through storytelling. Storytellers were very popular because their stories largely consisted also of history, and it was romanticized history of the Mughal period. but it was history of some shape or form, which stayed with people. And this poetical tradition, of course, I mean, I remember when Baghdad was being bombed. The day they started bombing Baghdad, I was in London and having lunch with Sadi Youssef, the great Iraqi poet. And he was weeping. We were both weeping, actually. And he said he had written a poem. What was it called? Jackal was in the title. And Jackal was a reference to all the Iraqi collaborationists who were meeting in London in a hotel with the British and American representatives to discuss the future of Iraq, even before the actual invasion. And he said, I've written this poem, which he recited to me and then translated into English because he'd written it in Arabic the day before. And this is what I meant about technology. He said, Tariq, I don't know how long this poem would have taken to reach Iraq, but I sent it this morning, and I've just got an email back from Basra saying they're reading it in the cafes. He said, in what other world could this have happened? So this poem was addressed to another friend of his, another exiled Iraqi poet, Muzaffar al-Nawab, who was living in exile in Damascus. And he read the poem, and within 24 hours, he'd written a reply to the poem with his own poem, and that was circulating. And that is the advantage of the technology today, that it can bypass official channels or the post office or whatever and can be circulated. And that is why having alternative networks, alternative challenges to the existing narrative becomes extremely important. And this is part of our culture now. Young people, most young people don't read the newspapers. If you tell them off, as I often do, they say, well, what should we read? It's all lies. It's difficult to deny that. You then say, well, it's not all lies. But you sound very old when you say that. Because they know it is. And they know what they're reading there is not going to tell them anything. And again, Gaza is not the first time. It's not the first time this has happened. They lied about Iraq. They lie constantly about Palestine. And, you know, papers of record like the New York Times invent stories. You know, during the time of the Gulf War, it was that Saddam Hussein had murdered babies in their cots in hospitals. You remember that one? Then it denied. No, that was not true. It's the same. The Gazans, the Palestinians, or Hamas, which it has killed and beheaded babies. I didn't believe it at all. I said, it's impossible. Why should they do that? And they didn't. We now know there is no evidence for it at all. So this world of lies is a world that is very dominant, and there's a fight going on between this world, the world of the establishments, and another world, which is the world of those who don't believe them and who send in the news. I mean, that's why Julian Assange, who is locked up in prison for 6 years for releasing a videotape sent to him from Iraq in which American pilots are joking with each other. There's a family going down there, 2 kids, a couple. Let's blow them up. Let's see if we can. And they blow them up. This was filmed. Actually filmed, I think by an Al Jazeera person, I'm not 100% sure, but it was part of the American archive. And Chelsea Manning took it, plucked it out, and emailed it to Assange, who put it out the very next day. That's why he's in prison. It's not just that we'll go and kill, we'll maim, we lie about it, and if you try and expose these lies, we'll punish you. This is the world we live in. not worth cocooning yourself away from this world. Sooner or later, this world will reach you in some shape or form. So that is why we're trying to do things in various parts of the world, by the way. Things are happening on the cultural front to give some support, not that we can do much, to the Palestinians. I mean, the Israelis have made Palestine now a world issue, which it hadn't been for some years, by the way. People had forgotten. It's now a world issue again. That goes without saying. And so no one is going to forget it this time. Because whether you're political or apolitical, whether you're 8 years old or 80 years old, the images that you have seen on mainstream television as well as alternative networks will stay with you forever. I mean, how can you not, how can you forget images of children, young children about to die? And how can you forget the images of the IDF soldiers celebrating this publicly in the streets? And that is why I have always argued that I'm not in favor of expanding wars and all that, but there are some things that can be done. The South Africans have done it. Many Latin American countries have done it. And I say this to my Turkish friends, especially when they ring and say, what do you think of Erdogan's latest statement saying this and that? I said, look, I'm fed up of listening to him. I'll be honest. If he wants to make an impact, why doesn't he just break off relations with Israel, like so many other countries are doing, or thinking of doing, and spare us these sort of demagogic homilies, which have nil impact on anyone because no one believes them. And at the very least, that could be done. And this is something which people know. People feel guilty about it, including people in the establishments. But what can we do? Well, you can do. You can do a lot. Now, I'm happy to answer questions, but I want to thank you for listening to me. And I'm going to end with a little 5-minute film of Isango, the company in South Africa I mentioned earlier, which is now very seriously committed to doing something big on Gaza that can travel to different parts of the world. And after that, I'll come back to answer your questions. Thank you.
Connection with Isango Theatre, and what is really special about their work is that the vision of social change and of cultural exchange is woven into everything that they do.
As it happens, along with Lee Hall, I am also an ambassador for the Sango Theatre Company in Cape Town, South Africa, where for many years I've been associated with their productions, worked with them, and visited them both there and on their travels as they tour internationally. They are undoubtedly one of the great international theatre companies of the world. I can offer my wholehearted, enthusiastic endorsement.
Where I am at the moment, I'm in Khayelitsha, and Khayelitsha is where I grew up. This is where I went to school, just close by from here. The work that Isango does reflects the community and the townships that we live in.
All our work grows from the people of this community, but it plays on international stages around the world, which brings a fantastic pride and a sense of purpose and achievement back into this community.
We become custodians, of our communities, and you see the pride in them watching the work that we create, but also knowing that we are playing the work that we create in international stages. So that means that international audiences can see their lives. Tula, tula, tula. We are very deliberate in the way that we work as a Isango. We empower the somewhat not empowered. Most of our actors and people who work in the company would not get these opportunities if it was not for Isango. When kids who aspire to be artists or musicians or whatever see the company on stage, they're inspired because people like them are doing exactly what they want to do.
Hi Tariq, my name is Sam. I'm a writer based in New York, and I'm one of those young people that you had mentioned that no longer has any faith in traditional media. I was talking to someone last night about that front page story that came out in the Times, I think about a month ago at this point, about Hamas's campaign of rape and how, there was this coordinated effort of sexual assault on October 7th, and within a few days, people on the internet came out and said, none of this is based in any serious evidence, and even the family of one of the, the star victim of the story came out and said the New York Times pressured us into the information they received from us, and it's all wrong. And even in the last week, it's been found that one of the reporters on the piece had no reporting experience before and turned out to be from Israeli intelligence. And one of the other reporters on the piece was her nephew that was coming straight out of college, had no serious reporting experience before that. And I, about a year ago, wrote for the New York Times, and I had thought that it was one of these, this apex of my career, one of the things that I've been wanting to do for my whole life as a journalist. And then as soon as all of this began, I reached out to my editor at the Times and I said, what's going on there? Like, should I even think about coming back? And he said, no, just save yourself and don't come back. because you will not get respected and you will be blackballed if it's found that you are in support of this. And at this point, I'm wondering what there is left to do, because traditional media behaves this way, and then there's new media like Vice or all these other magazines that are beginning to either be bought up or subsumed or whatever, that were at least somewhat open in what they were willing to cover, and they're all beginning to fail. And it seems to be because of social media, which at one point is drawing people's attention and taking away any serious need to have accountability for the quality for what you're consuming. At the same time, if it wasn't for social media, what would have happened with this cover story? This campaign of rape that apparently had happened. It would have been a new WMD moment of just continuing to justify what's happening in Gaza. And if people had not come out and disproven it, who knows how it would be spoken about today. So what are we supposed to do at this point? What should we be embracing? What should we be trying to build? It seems that as a young media worker, there isn't a lot of room to grow anymore.
No, you're right. I have to agree with you. It's extremely difficult. And, sort of making false promises or predictions, I can't do that. I've tried to avoid doing it most of my life. But I think what needs to be done, and when an article on the social network stands out, it's not Yabu sucks or, even genocide Joe's got to go. I mean, that's quite good, but it doesn't explain too much. I mean, I think what we lack on the social media, which some people are realizing, is seriously researched articles which no longer appear in our media, except on rare occasions. And these seriously researched articles are sometimes coming out now and on stacks and various other forms. They don't have one big umbrella, so that if you want to go to this, you go to that particular umbrella, media umbrella, and find the piece. But I think that is the way to go, because things are getting worse and worse. They're not getting better in terms of imparting information, so that we need to impart information that makes people want to do the same thing themselves and say, God, why didn't I read that elsewhere? And people like yourself and others could do that, actually. It obviously it requires work and it requires money. But it'd be fantastic if there were just one or two things like that on a global scale. I mean, some people do it, and it has an impact, but it's slow. And then my other worry is that, let's say we get something like this off the ground regularly, not intermittently. What is to stop the state, whichever state, from banning it or just taking it off the networks? This is beginning to happen more and more in a number of countries. It's not an American speciality, particularly so far, but it is beginning to happen in different parts of the world, and it will be taken up. And because it almost seems to me sometimes that the Western democracies, as they call themselves, cannot bear criticism which really challenges the core values of what they're doing. So just to give you an example, in London now, since October, literally millions of people have marched. 500,000 this week, 500,000 that week, millions. Very rare to have a proper report in the mainstream media. There's been no violence on the side of the marchers and demonstrators. And there was a particularly unpleasant British Home Secretary who started attacking the marchers for being hate marches. I got so fed up with this that I was being interviewed on radio and I couldn't control myself, which sometimes happens. And they said, the Home Secretary, Mrs. Braverman, had said, these are hate marches. Are they? I said, yeah, we all hate her. Now, even the television interviewer on radio started laughing because she was unprepared for that. But it was so true, and even the police hate her. It's not just people like me. You know, there's widespread hatred, but no one will ever say it. So people have, because they have no trust and faith in the mainstream media at all, they think that no one will listen. But occasionally you can get stuff on, and I wouldn't give up on it totally. Try. But the key thing is well-researched, well-written articles, and where you have all the proof with you. This is where you got the information from. That we lack. Not just us, the mainstream media doesn't bother about it, but our side shouldn't be so, it shouldn't be clumsy like that. Last question? No? Ah, okay. Yeah?
Thank you so very much. I think when you brought the video clip at last, you are prompting how thinking through these questions of global humanities in the present through this constellation, right? So if we bring Haiti, the Congo, Palestine together as a constellation, how can we really talk about global humanities with all complex intricacies of global problems? Thank you so much.
If I got your question right, correct me if I'm wrong, please. I didn't get the last part of it. What was the last part you said relating to the 90s?
I think when you say, for instance, Ukraine, and so, you know, the war in Sudan, in Ethiopia, millions have been lost. Yes, we are confronted. We cannot talk about the Palestinian issues, not only in the global north, but in the global south, in Ethiopia, because of, you know, this overarching power that is really dominating the everyday space. Then bringing like Haiti, the Congo, which we have not been talking about in these kinds of spaces, bringing this together, how can we really reflect more about the global condition of humanities in the present? That's
well, look, I mean, I get your point. The thing is this, that still now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and that system, and since the big turn in China, the United States has been, without doubt, the hegemonic dominant power in the world. It still is. Whatever else you might think, it still is. It has the largest military force in the world, which is larger than the next 8 armies. The 7th of those armies is the Israeli army, by the way, also quite large. So they feel that they can control the world. And if you look at what's happened to the Middle East, this couldn't have happened during the Cold War. I mean, the Middle East has been wrecked. The war in Iraq, 2 million people dead. Once in the States, someone said, how can you say that? I said, that's the figure given by John Hopkins, who sent a medical team from your country to see how many had died in Iraq. And I said, the official government you set up is saying there are 5 million orphans. So it ties up, unfortunately. Syria, an attempt to topple the regime. Libya, NATO attack on Libya to topple the regime, and Hillary Clinton says, we came, we saw, he died, i.e. the brutal way in which Gaddafi was lynched. That is what Hillary Clinton said. So people should have realized long ago, really, of what was going on, that the Middle East in some shape or form was being recolonized in a new way. But they didn't. Gaza has brought everything to a head now, in my opinion. And people are beginning to think widely, not simply in the Middle East, but globally. And if you look at the way the United States reacted when the bulk of the world refused to back sanctions against Russia, they behaved like children, punishing irrelevant small countries, unable to punish China or India, which had not voted for sanctions either, as if, how dare you challenge us and our right to rule. But I think the tragedy of Gaza has woken people up because they know how this war could be stopped overnight by the United States intervening and telling them to stop it. Any other country which did something they didn't like, they'd have yanked the person who was sitting as prime minister or military dictator and thrown him or her in the dustbin. But not with Israel. They don't do that. So this question is, in fact, beginning to trouble lots of people who have not been political before. How can you not be? And, we fight the best way we can. But I'm not saying change is on the way overnight, but I think this realization is making people think. And also attempts to stop these. I mean, in Britain, the government is trying to stop people demonstrating now because it's been so effective. Peaceful, non-violent demonstrations, millions saying to the government, in a country where there's no opposition. Britain is a country without an official opposition in the House of Commons. The Labour leaders support what the government is doing on many different fronts. So the voice of the opposition is heard on the streets. Or yesterday in a by-election in Rochdale, just listen to this absurdity. The Labour candidate was of Muslim origin, was a Muslim. He made some stupid remarks about Israel, but there's some really stupid remarks. Instead of telling him off and educating him, they dump him and say, we're not going to back you. Because of the electoral laws, they can't replace him with someone, so there's no official Labour candidate. Comes in George Galloway, a veteran anti-war campaigner, stands in the seat and wins a huge majority. And his first statement he makes, after being declared the victor and the Member of Parliament for Rochdale, is, as far as I'm concerned, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, for those of you who don't know Britain, and Keir Starmer are cheeks of the same backside. Now, to have a politician like that in the House of Commons, I think, is a big leap forward.